The year was 1493, and Europe was trembling with excitement. Just a year earlier, a Genoese sailor by the name of Christopher Columbus had stepped back onto Spanish soil after a voyage so daring, so improbable, that it rattled the foundations of the known world. He had sailed west across what Europeans called the Ocean Sea, braving waters thought endless and monstrous, and returned not empty-handed, but with wonders. He carried with him bright feathered parrots that squawked in strange tongues, handfuls of gold trinkets that glittered like promises, curious plants with scents never before inhaled in Europe, and most shocking of all, men and women, people from lands no European had ever recorded, who stood bewildered before the Spanish court, their very presence proof of Columbus's discovery. When Columbus unfurled his stories before King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Spain's Catholic monarchs, the court gasped and whispered. He spoke of islands bathed in eternal sunshine, of rivers and mountains teeming with untapped riches, of civilizations ripe for conversion. To Ferdinand and Isabella, this was not mere good fortune. This was providence. For centuries, Spain had fought to reclaim its lands from the Muslim Moors. It had been a long and bloody struggle, a crusade stretching across generations. Finally, in 1492, the banners of Castile and Aragon had been planted triumphantly over the walls of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold. The Reconquista was complete. The cross of Christ now flew over every corner of Spain. The monarchs were elated, their armies victorious, their coffers filling, their priests jubilant. They believed that God himself had chosen them for greatness. And now, as Columbus described the distant islands across the Atlantic, it seemed as though heaven was opening yet another door. Spain, victorious on land, was now destined for greatness on the seas. A theatre for empire had appeared, vast and unclaimed, or so they believed. But Spain had a problem. For decades, Portugal had stood as the uncontested champion of exploration. Long before Spain had even unified its kingdoms, Portuguese caravels, sleek, nimble ships with their triangular lateen sails, were venturing farther into the unknown than any European fleet dared. The name most tied to this bold tradition was Prince Henry the Navigator. Though he never sailed far himself, Henry had built the foundations of an empire. He gathered the best cartographers, shipbuilders, and captains in his school at Sagres, turning Portugal into the beating heart of Europe's age of discovery. One by one, the Portuguese began to unravel the secrets of the Atlantic. They charted the Azores and Madeira, lush islands that would become stepping stones for empire. They pushed further south, edging along the coast of Africa, mapping it piece by piece. Each new cape rounded, each river entered, felt like a victory against the darkness of the unknown. Their ships carried crosses and flags, and every new landfall was marked not just with the planting of a standard, but with a prayer. For they claimed these territories in both the name of God and of their king. By the late 15th century, Portugal's ambitions had stretched beyond the horizon. The daring voyages of men like Bartolomeu Dias, who in 1488 rounded the fearsome Cape of Good Hope, proved that a sea route to India was possible. The riches of Asia, spices, silks, and precious stones seemed within reach. Portugal was not only skilled, it was blessed on paper. The popes of earlier decades had already issued bulls granting Portugal dominion over the lands of Africa and the routes to India. The Church, eager to see heathen lands brought under Christian sway, had effectively drawn up a legal map of Portuguese supremacy. To the crown in Lisbon, the oceans were not neutral waters. They were a divine inheritance, a sacred trust given by God himself. And then came Columbus. when word reached King John VI of Portugal that the Genoese adventurer, sailing under the Spanish flag, had not only crossed the Atlantic, but returned alive with treasures and strange peoples. His court was stunned. At first, disbelief reigned. Surely this was an exaggeration, or worse, a trick. But as reports multiplied, anger replaced doubt. For John, the question was simple. By what right did Spain claim these lands? Had not treaties, solemnly signed and blessed by Rome, already drawn the world into Portuguese hands? Columbus's islands, whether in Asia or some unknown western land, should by precedent belong to him, not Spain. The Portuguese king bristled, his pride wounded. He saw in Spain's triumph not just a challenge to his empire, but an insult to decades of Portuguese daring. He had invested blood, treasure and genius into ruling the seas, and now Spain, fresh from its Reconquista, threatened to leapfrog over centuries of Portuguese achievement. Spain, for all its joy, realized the danger immediately. Columbus's return had lit a fire of triumph, but it also carried the risk of war. Portugal had ships, navigators, and the legal precedents to fight this claim. If Spain hesitated, if it failed to anchor its rights firmly, all that Columbus had discovered could be lost in disputes or seized by Portuguese fleets. Ferdinand and Isabella, cautious yet shrewd, understood they needed something stronger than Columbus's word or even Spain's armies. They needed divine authority. They needed a voice so powerful it could settle the matter across all Christendom. And so they turned to Rome, to the Vatican, to the palace of Pope Alexander VI, a man whose seal could sanctify conquest, silence kings, and divide worlds with a stroke of ink. A man who, though he had never seen the Atlantic, would soon draw invisible lines across it. Lines that would shape the destiny of continents. Enter the Pope. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was no ordinary pope. By the time he ascended to the throne of St. Peter in 1492, his reputation was already infamous. Whispers filled the corridors of Rome about his appetite for wealth, his brazen nepotism, and his scandalous personal life. He was a man who had fathered children openly, enriched his family shamelessly, and maneuvered with the skill of a serpent through the venomous politics of Renaissance Italy. But if Alexander VI was corrupt, he was also formidable. The papacy was more than a spiritual office. It was the ultimate broker of power in Christendom, and Alexander wielded it like a master. Kings and princes could command armies, but the Pope could command souls. His bulls, stamped with leaden seals, were not just words. They were divine decrees that bent the course of nations. Spain knew this well. Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from their triumph in Granada, enjoyed a close friendship with Alexander. The Borgia Pope of Spanish origin himself was inclined to favor his countrymen. When the monarchs approached him in 1493, their request was as bold as it was urgent. They wanted the Pope to declare formally, publicly, irrevocably, that all lands newly discovered across the Atlantic, and any yet to be found in the West, belonged not to Portugal, but to Spain. This was no small request. With a single signature, the Pope would be dividing the known and unknown world. He would decide which crown had the right to conquer, convert, and claim. He would settle a rivalry not with armies, but with ink. And so, in the spring of 1493, in the solemn halls of the Vatican, Alexander took up his pen. He drafted a bull that would echo through history. In lofty, sanctified language, he clothed Spain's hunger for empire in the garments of divine will. He declared that Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, had been chosen by God to bring the light of Christ to lands beyond the sea, and to them he granted, with papal authority, dominion over all territories west of an imaginary line drawn across the Atlantic, lands not already ruled by a Christian prince. This document was called Inter Caetera. With it, Alexander VI gave Spain the world, or at least half of it. The Papal Bull Inter Caetera. On the morning of May 4th, 1493, the Vatican scribes prepared parchment and seal. The decree that left Pope Alexander VI's chambers that day was no ordinary order. It was a papal bull, a solemn instrument stamped with the authority of heaven itself. Its name was Inter Caetera. Written in soaring, sanctified language, it cloaked the sharp teeth of empire with the robes of divine mission. The bull declared that Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and their heirs after them, had been chosen by Providence to carry the light of Christianity to barbarous nations beyond the seas. And in that holy mandate lay the heart of the matter. All lands discovered 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, so long as they were not already ruled by a Christian prince, were now granted to Spain. It was not just a blessing, it was a partition of the earth. With a single stroke of the papal pen, Alexander VI split the unknown globe in two, the west for Spain, the east for Portugal. Invisible lines were drawn across oceans the Pope had never sailed, over continents he could not imagine, dividing not just territory, but the destinies of peoples yet unborn. Here, in ink and seal, billions of lives were silently assigned to crowns that had never set eyes on them. The human drama behind the lines. In Spain, the bull arrived like thunder, rolling through the court. Picture Christopher Columbus, puffed with pride, striding through the palace halls, basking in his new title. Admiral of the Ocean Sea, he carried himself with the air of a prophet vindicated. Around him, courtiers whispered feverishly, whispers of gold-filled rivers, temples of unimaginable wealth, kingdoms waiting to kneel before the Catholic monarchs. Soldiers daydreamed of conquest, of fortunes carved with the sword. Priests spoke in hushed awe of pagan souls ready for baptism, entire nations waiting to be remade in the image of Christ. Merchants, ever practical, scratched figures into wax tablets, already imagining new trade routes and ports filled with exotic goods. To them, Inter Caetera was not just parchment, it was a charter for destiny. But across the Iberian Peninsula, in Portugal, the atmosphere was fire and fury. King John II received the news with clenched jaw and blazing eyes. For decades his kingdom had been first at sea, first in daring, first in discovery. His sailors had hugged the unknown coasts of Africa, faced storms and death to carve a path toward Asia. And now, with a single decree, the Pope had handed the Western Ocean, its riches, its mysteries, its future, to Spain. It was robbery, dressed in holy words. John VI did not sit quietly. He thundered with protest. He sent envoys to Rome, demanding the bull be reconsidered. He reminded Spain of prior treaties, of Portugal's papal privileges, of the risks and sacrifices his kingdom had already borne for Christendom's glory. His tone sharpened, veiled threats of war slipped into diplomatic letters. For if Spain would not yield, Portugal had ships enough to take what it considered rightfully its own. The two kingdoms now stared across the ocean as though staring down the barrel of a loaded cannon. The seas were no longer just water, they were the future, and by the Pope's decree, that future had been handed, shimmering and vast, into Spain's grasp, toward the Treaty of Tordesillas. The ink of Inter Caetera had barely dried when the seas themselves seemed to tremble with tension. Spain rejoiced, its court intoxicated with visions of empire. But in Lisbon, fury burned hotter with each passing day. King John II of Portugal was no man to be cowed by a decree from Rome. He believed the oceans were Portugal's inheritance, earned through decades of perilous voyages and sanctified by earlier papal blessings. To him, Alexander VI's bull was theft concealed in piety. He called his council together. Voices rose in anger. "Spain has stolen our future," cried one nobleman. "We have charted these seas with our blood. Our dead sailors lie in waters Spain has never touched," declared another. John II's messengers sped to Rome, their words sharp, their message plain. Portugal would not accept this division. To the Spanish monarchs he sent letters laced with threats. If Spain sought to sail west, Portugal would answer with fleets and steel. For a brief moment, war seemed inevitable. Two crowns stood ready to clash, not over borders on land, but over a horizon of limitless promise. But Ferdinand and Isabella were no fools. Spain had only just risen from centuries of war in Granada. Its coffers were rich in spirit, but not overflowing with coin. A naval war with Portugal, seasoned, experienced, and commanding the finest sailors in Europe, was a risk they could not afford. And so messengers rode and sailed. Offers were made, envoys exchanged. The Pope's bull was a victory for Spain, yes. But if it led to ruinous war, what good was it? Both kingdoms knew they needed a compromise, something that would satisfy pride and avoid bloodshed, while still keeping the oceans as their private prize. The meeting in Tordesillas. In the summer of 1494, representatives of Spain and Portugal met in the Castilian town of Tordesillas. Picture the scene. Long tables, parchments spread, quills ready, tempers flaring. Outside, the air buzzed with the murmurs of soldiers, sailors, and common folk who knew history was being written within those walls. The negotiations dragged on. Portugal pressed hard. The papal line, a mere 100 leagues west of the Azores, was intolerable. It gave Spain too much, leaving Portugal with little more than a corner of the seas it had long dominated. Spain resisted, unwilling to surrender the divine favor of Alexander VI. Yet the Spaniards were also pragmatic. To secure peace, they would yield, but only enough to satisfy Portugal without surrendering their dreams of empire. At last, an agreement took form. The line of division would not remain as the Pope had drawn it. Instead, it would shift further west, 370 leagues from the Cape Verde Islands. It was a small move on paper, but in the scale of the globe, it was enormous. Neither side fully understood what this would mean, for the New World was still a mystery. Yet destiny hid in that adjustment. For when explorers later mapped South America, that westward shift gave Portugal a slice of land. What would one day be called Brazil. Spain, meanwhile, received nearly everything else. The vast sweep of the Americas, from Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, fell beneath the shadow of the Spanish crown. The aftermath. Thus was signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. The oceans were divided as though they were a chessboard laid across the earth. East for Portugal, west for Spain. The agreement was solemnized, blessed, and ratified by Rome. Two kingdoms had avoided war, but in doing so, they had carved up the future of the world between them. Neither Ferdinand, nor Isabella, nor John II could have imagined the consequences. The Americas, Africa, Asia, all would soon feel the long reach of Iberian sails. And yet, in the halls of Europe, the deed was done with ink and seal. No thought was given to the millions already inhabiting these lands. Their voices were not invited to Tordesillas. Their fates had been decided without them. The seas no longer belonged to all. With the Treaty of Tordesillas, they had been claimed, parcelled, and owned.